Welcome back to Biblical Leadership, and what we want to do with this particular class, CH1, is return to the book of Acts in chapter 27. And we're talking about, in this particular section, taking the initiative. And that's what leaders must do. The problem is that you cannot lead from behind. You have to lead in front. People will follow a leader. Listen to me carefully. If you have a title, you have a position, but you don't have people that are following you, you are not a leader. Let's be very clear about that. You may have been appointed. You may have been chosen. You may have been designated by somebody else to lead something. But if people do not follow you, you are not a leader. You've been a designated leader. You've been an appointed leader. You've been a chosen leader by somebody. But a leader must lead. He must have people who follow. So the leadership always takes the initiative. Leadership does not raise his finger in the wind to find out which way the wind is blowing and which way people want to go and then lead them in that direction. You must operate from a sense of conviction. There must be a conviction. I don't care what country you're in. I don't care what culture you are in. I don't care what part of the world that you are in, what language you are in. A leader must lead at all times. That does not make you a dictator. Of course not. But you must lead. And too many pastors, listen to me very carefully here, too many pastors are cowards. You heard what I just said. You are a coward. You do not lead in your church. Your church dictates the terms of surrender for you, and then you lay down and you play dead and you roll over, and they're the ones who lead and you follow them. This is an act of insanity. As I have the opportunity to travel extensively from many, many churches and to travel around the world into many different countries to teach and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, to teach the full counsel of the Word of God, to teach other pastors on how to do what God's called them to do. I see this way too often where the pastor is fearful. He's afraid of the deacons, most of them who are serving as deacons are not even biblical deacons, okay? And they're afraid of the church, so they don't lead. They lead from behind is what they do. They're just a puppet. That's all they are. Well, my friend, listen to me carefully. If that's your position, the best thing you can do is resign, because you are not the leader. Resign from the pulpit. You are not the leader. You have been manipulated and told what you must do, and then you march to the beat of the drum of someone else. A leader must lead. I don't care how difficult the situation is. Biblical leadership never capitulates, never surrenders, okay, to the masses or to the group. It's quite the contrary. The group, the followers follow him. He doesn't follow them. So I want to take you in this particular session, and we're going to spend some time, quite amount of time in the next few sessions, just on this subject alone. So I'm going to dedicate some time here today as we go through this. Right? So buckle up your seats, okay? And let's go for the ride here. Open your Bibles to the book of Acts chapter 27. Taking the initiative. In Acts chapter 27, let's put this in its proper perspective. And let's look at least in the first few verses here, starting in verse 1. And let's work our way down to verse 8. And then we're going to focus most of our time on verses 4 and 5, because that's where we want to spend some time in these next few sessions here. And I just want to put this in perspective. Now, I'm reading the Bible version that I teach out of is the New American Standard Version, which is ASB Bible. Okay? That's the version. Now, you may have a King James, you may have a ESV, English Standard Version Bible, you may have an NIV, you may have a New King James Version. I don't know how many versions are out there. It's just ridiculous the amount of versions that are out there. But I teach out of the NASB because it's one of the better versions, one of the better translations alongside the ESV, the English Standard Version Bible. That's one of the better versions of the Bible. Now, and including, let me not forget also the New King James Version, which has improved greatly. So any one of those three versions are more than acceptable. But whatever version you happen to choose from, just follow the thought pattern with me. In Acts chapter 27, I want you to notice with me, starting in verse 1, and this is the voyage to Rome, and this is where it begins. Paul is on this ship, and he's being taken. Now, by this time in the experience of the life of Paul, he's already been involved in multiple shipwrecks. This is a man with lots of experience of watching a ship go down at sea and being left out at sea to drown. So this is a man that he's in the hold. He's at the bottom of the ship as a prisoner. Okay? I want you to understand that. Okay? So this is a man who understands shipping. He understands what it is to travel this route, okay, that they're going about to take. Let's begin. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in the Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus and Macedonian of Thessalonica. The next day we put out in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. Now, if you remember in the last few sessions, we had this conversation. Now, let's pick up in verse 4. From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days with difficulty and had arrived off Cneus, which is since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off of Salmone. And with difficulty sailing past, if we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Now, let me try to see if we can put some of this into perspective here. Okay. So what we want to focus specifically here is taking initiative. Now, we're going to have to go through some details. This is the advantage of not teaching something quickly, but slowly. Doing expositional teaching and preaching is going verse by verse and explaining the background to the text so that you have a better comprehension of what's being said. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because when the scriptures were written and they were delivered at the time that they were delivered, it was written in a language and in a cultural language and a cultural setting of that day of which people understood, and it did not require a lot of explanation. However, you and I, we are approximately 2,000 plus years removed from that date, from when it was originally written and given to the people of God, which is us today and them of that day. Okay? They understood the language and how words were being used and what the cultural context and what the political and economic context was of their day. However, you and I are so far removed, we don't understand it. So the responsibility, it behooves us who stand in the pulpits, wherever it is that we find ourselves all over the world, is to explain the background to our people. It's so that they have a better understanding, a clearer understanding, a contextual understanding of what the Word of God actually says, rather than finding ourselves lost in the muck and the mire of church interpretation, modern day interpretation. And the focus that we're going to give it here is the taking initiative. And you've heard the phrase that the going gets tough and the tough get going, right? You've heard that phrase, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. This is a classic example of that in the scriptures that we just finished reading from verses 1 through 8. Our focus is verse 4 and 5. When Paul's long journey to Rome got underway again after the brief stop in Sidon, the ship encountered what would be the bane of the whole trip, contrary winds, and this was going to be the problem for the entire trip. They were going into headwinds, contrary winds. And Luke writes this, and I want you to notice what he says. He says in verse 4 and 5, from there we put out to sea, that is from Sidon, and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. Now, it's really difficult to explain all this, but I'm going to give it an attempt to do so. And the best way I can do it is that in your notes, I'm including a map, a general map, okay? So that you can kind of see the pattern that is taking place here. So I want you to understand that if you look at a map very carefully, and which is going to be provided into your notes when you download them, I want you to look at, and those of you who are here, you're going to have that with you right now. But here's what I want you to see is that if you're going to go along the coast of Israel, okay, all the way up into Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, and you just keep following that all the way around, okay, and then you got to shoot across to the island of Crete, which is part of Greece, or shoot across directly to the mainland of Greece, okay? And this is the pattern of where the ship is going. It's going from port to port all the way around because the winds are coming, and they're coming fiercely toward them. There's contrary winds. They're not sailing with the winds. They're sailing contrary to the winds. These are headwinds. And this area was known for major storms. And you go, well, Brother Eddie, why do we have to learn about all sailing and wind and all this? That's really not important. No, quite the contrary. It is. Not that I expect you to be sailing. Perhaps you may be. I don't know that. But the point is, you need to understand the details so you can see how Paul takes the initiative to become the leader. Remember, he is not the designated leader. He is not the designated leader. He is the prisoner. And the designated leader is the centurion Julius, okay, of the Augustan Guard. He was part of the Imperial Roman Guard. He is under his watch. Paul is his prisoner. Okay? He is the main leader and the captain of the boat as well. They are the designated leaders, the appointed leaders. But eventually you're going to see how the crew and all the ship, okay, everybody begins to listen to what Paul has to say. You see, leaders are people who lead people and people follow. So you need to understand that. So in order to grasp the concept in its entirety, is we're going to get involved into the minutia, into the details of what is actually taking place here, so you can see the credibility of Paul's leadership rise to the top from the bottom of this ship. And then you will see how the credibility of the captain and the centurion guard, who's at the top, it descends all the way to the bottom of the sea. So here's where we're going to go. In order to see how Paul's leadership lifts him even higher among the men on the ship until he is completely in charge and everyone is dependent upon him, we need to look into the details of this story. We need to look into the details of this story. Cyprus is an island just south of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, north and west of the land of Israel, and that's the reason why I provided a map for you guys to look at. Myra is a harbor town, a little farther west and just on the southern tip of Asia Minor, in what we would call modern-day Turkey. So after leaving Sidon, on the northern coast of the modern-day Lebanon, the ship's captain turned west toward Rome and sailed northwesterly in the direction of his home port, which would be Adramyttium. And Adramyttium is the port where this particular ship is from. Cyprus was the closest island and a large one, and the winds were from the west, so they sailed to the east of Cyprus, trying to avoid the stiff winds as much as possible. Obviously, a sailing vessel cannot sail straight into a strong wind. We know that. We're talking about a sailing vessel. These are the vessels with sails. I'm not talking about those big modern ships that we have today, that are size of 5 football fields. That's not what I'm talking about. These are sailing vessels with sails, okay? The only way to advance into the headwinds is by a maneuver called tacking. Tacking, tacking. Tacking involves steering a zigzag course first perpendicular to the wind, utilizing the sails to gain speed, and then turning into the wind and dropping the sails to allow the ship's momentum to carry it into the wind. And so tacking is, if you're going straight on, okay, into the winds, okay, you would then take your ship and you would do about a 35 degree to 45 degree angle, okay, and sometimes, depending on the wind, they will literally go 40, they will almost drop down to 25 degrees, and the wind is coming harshly at you, and you would just lift your wind, you would lift up your sails, and you would take off in this direction, tacking. And then, when you picked up enough speed, because the wind is blowing you, so this is the effect. This is literally the effect. The wind is blowing, and you're coming at a perpendicular angle, okay? Okay, not exactly this way, but you were coming in at an angle, and what happened was the speed of the wind coming, okay, would hit those sails, and then it would move that ship even faster in a contrary direction. And then when you picked up enough speed, okay, and you're moving at a fast clip, at a good speed, you would drop your sails and you would turn that ship. And because you're moving at such a speed, you could now come into the headwinds, right? And then again, you would do it again. And then you would do it again. So it was zigzag, zigzag, zigzag. This is how you would sail into the headwinds, into contrary winds. Now, depending on what kind of a ship, you had to make sure, so there was all kinds of danger associated with this, because you had to have a crew that was very experienced, extremely experienced, okay? And they would wrap the whole of the ship, the whole, H-U-L-L, the whole of the ship. And so basically you have this ship, okay, that's sailing in the water, and they would literally wrap ropes around it all the way. They would tie these ropes, okay, to hold the boards. Remember, these were wooden ships, okay? And they would add, what you and I would call today tar, you know, that black tar, asphalt, okay? And to hold this ship together, okay? And because these winds are blowing, and now the what you would call the sea waves were just blistering. Okay? They were pounding on the hull of the ship. So this was a dangerous maneuver, and you had to know exactly what you were doing. This is exactly what this ship was attempting to do. Then the sails are raised at the opportune moment, and the ship runs perpendicular to the wind again. They would repeat this. The maneuver is extremely difficult and labor intensive, but it makes it possible to sail into the moderate headwind. Now, there were several kinds of ships in those days, and some were large ships ventured into the open sea to transport loads of cargo through the shipping lanes, which you'll see on the map. Others were port hoppers. These were port hoppers, P-O-R-T, port hoppers, H-O-P-P-E-R-S, port hoppers. They would hop from port to port along the coast, and that's how they would make it all the way approximately anywhere between 1,900 to 2,500 miles. They could travel somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 kilometers, okay? And this is how they would do it especially during the winter season, okay? And the problem is that during the spring and the fall and the summer, there were also storms. So there was constant storms out there for different reasons. So port hoppers were smaller ships, okay, that went from port to port, and this is how they would make it in these unbearable conditions for seafaring lanes. Others were port hoppers that skidded along near the coastline and moved from port to port. This was apparently a ship of the second variety, because Luke in his writings describes its journey from port to port. And it went from Caesarea to Sidon, and from Sidon to Myra, and to the southern tip of Asia Minor. If you recall, that's what we were reading earlier. Go back there again with me. In Acts 27, verse 4 and 5, it says, "From there we put out to sea from Sidon and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed in Myra of Lycia." Okay, so you can see this was a port hopper, right? So I want you to know that's the first ship they're on. Now, this is about more or less, the chronology is kind of a little difficult to pinpoint, but we can get it from all the information. We can deduce it from the information in the scriptures that are being given to us. Okay? More or less, this starts out somewhere around mid-August. Mid-August is more or less when they begin to sail. So the route was somewhat out of the way for the journey to Rome. They're going all the way up the coast here. Okay, Rome is in this other direction here, but it would have been a straight shot west from Sidon to Rhodes, which is nearly halfway to Rome. But because of the winds, instead of sailing straight from Rhodes, they made a detour and took them north of Cyprus, a safer but less direct route. So now, I want you to bear in mind that this is somewhere around mid-August. This is a long time to be on this ship, okay, when they start out. So the chronological clues in the book of Acts, and that's the best way that I can think of putting it. The chronological clues that are given to us in the book of Acts suggest that it was mid-August, which is consistent with what we know about the wind patterns of the region. In August, the winds are westerly. That's what we know so far, okay? So the sailing season was quickly coming to an end, and from approximately November 11th, more or less, to the end of March, the winter winds on the Mediterranean can be extremely treacherous, so no ships made any regular crossings during those months. Some attempted, and this is the reason why those shipping lanes also to this day have many ships still at the bottom of the sea along those shipping lanes. And even in the early autumn or the fall, from September 14th to around November 11th, more or less, travel on the Mediterranean could be risky as well. Remember, they have the 4 seasons, but they also had 4 different types of storms that constantly hit these shipping lanes. So time was short to make the journey, and the speed was of the essence, and that's really important to understand. Time is short and speed is important. According to the maritime historians, the journey from Sidon to Myra into a headwind would have taken approximately 9 days. You get me? 9 days, approximately. By the time Paul and his entourage, the entire ship, arrived in Myra, the dangerous season was already approaching, so it took them a lot longer than they had anticipated. Myra itself had a harbor. The city itself was some 2 miles inland, but the harbor was busy, active port, chiefly because for the vessels from Egypt. There was a lot of ships that came in from Egypt. Egypt was a major source for grain for the Roman Empire, and ships would bring grain from Egypt to the granaries of Myra, offload, and return to Egypt. And other ships bound for Rome would collect the grains and carry it to the imperial capital, and there happened to be Myra, one of these ships bound for Italy. And this is the ship, kind of ship that Paul gets on with the Roman guard. And that's really important to understand. Now we move from one ship to a second type of ship.